Hi everyone, welcome to the Digital Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Tim. Tim, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Tom, thank you so much for having me this morning. So, Tim Judge, President and CEO of Atlanta-based Agillitics. We focus on data analytics for the supply chain, and just happy to be here today talking with you.
Nice, nice. Tell me a little bit about the backstory to Agillitics, Tim. What was the genesis behind the starting of the company?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I've been in supply chain now for about 20 years. Came down to Atlanta went to Georgia Tech as an industrial engineer, and being in Atlanta, which is, arguably one of the largest hubs for supply chain, kind of got right into it and really dove into the software side. So supply chain execution solutions, transportation, warehouse management. And what I saw as the common theme as more and more of these supply chain systems were adopted in the market, it produced more and more data. And even with the great technology and the best in class solutions that are out there, leaders really struggled with making decisions kind of cross supply chain. So if you think about, obviously, supply chain being a series of interconnections that need to manage, software even more so enables that. But oftentimes, your data is in many, many different places, and you're trying to align metrics and KPIs across areas. So almost about 10 years ago now, I launched Agillitics really with the single focus of, hey, how do we make these supply chain, leaders and managers, supervisors be able to make better decisions across the supply chain by enabling, better use of data.
Okay, and how are you making better use of data for your clients?
Yeah, and it kind of it's been a really exciting and evolution over, I would say, the last 10 years, where technology in many different areas outside of supply chain, whether that be marketing and sales and cloud computing, has really, exploded. And I think to some degree, operations and supply chain generally has been a little bit on the slower side to catch up with technology. So really what we tried to do is, hey, look at the market. What are the best technologies that are out there outside of supply chain, and really help companies kind of understand and utilize that technology to apply to the supply chain. So that's taken many different forms. At first, there were solutions like Hadoop and, taking data and more of, what they call an ETL process of extract, transform, and then load. What companies found it was really easy to get the data out, but really hard and difficult to make decisions based on the data. So that's evolved over time. But now it's really with distributed computing and the cost to store and report on data that's come down over time. It's become much easier to help companies define a data strategy, get near real time data from all of the different systems on premise to the cloud, and then really enable a turnkey type solution to understand, hey, how are we doing today? What decisions can we make to impact future decisions? How do we take actionable insights and prescriptive actions based on that data, and really layering in best-in-class technology on top of a clean data set?
Cool, Tim. And can you give me an idea of specifically what kind of data it is we're referring to? Maybe give me a practical example of, a problem one of your customers faced and a solution that you came up with for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, we work with a lot of large retailers and consumer brands, really anyone that ships product, across the supply chain. So what's a common one that we've helped customers in the past is really understanding, labor within a distribution center. Mm-hmm. So we really get to the granular level of data And even if you take the average, DC today, you may have, you obviously have, clock-in type systems like Kronos, and you have warehouse management systems like Manhattan and Blue Yonder. You may have labor management systems also from those vendors. You may have material handling equipment, everything from ASRS to conveyors to WCS systems, and now WES systems and execution systems within the four walls. So even within a simple example of a distribution center, you may have 6 or 7 systems where you're collecting data. Often they don't talk to each other. So a simple use case is really, where does, my labor need to be at each area at the DC at a given time. All right. So I may have, obviously, people doing picking, replenishment, receiving, inventory control, etc. And the natural changes in order flow into the DC, whether that's inbound orders and shipments, or whether that's being orders that are picking, they're going out, or loading trucks, fluctuates throughout the day just naturally, right?
Sure.
How customers order. So it's really important to maximize the efficiency of labor to really understand where people need to be at each area of the DC at a given time. So that's very common and been challenging for a lot of our customers as these more and more systems come out. And certain systems could be kind of seen as a black box where we don't have visibility to the incoming orders. So what we do is pulling data upstream as much as possible from whether that's an ERP or an order management system, pulling in all of the real-time inventory data from a warehouse management system, pulling in any engineered labor standards and calculations based on the labor, as well as WCS and WES information to really forecast out not only, hey, where do my people need to be working in the DC at a given time, but how many should I staff over time for tomorrow, next week, next month? So that really that labor monitoring and forecasting capabilities and real time, shifting of labor within the DC can mean, a very, very high return on investment for most companies that even though they're investing in all of those best in class systems, really having a way to make better decisions based on them.
Okay, and I assume if you're monitoring labor, people working in DCs, that there are a lot of potential privacy and security issues that you're looking out for as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a bunch of our team today in Europe, and because we understand, the security, and we even see it today as a company, just emails and people trying to get into our data and buy gift cards from our employees, and we really made sure that we picked the solutions that are technologies that are part of our stack, and the way that we handle our customers' data as if it were our own. So we have a lot of the processes, and we do pen tests and SOX 2 compliance and GDPR type compliance and processes to really make sure that we're protecting our customers' data, as well as adopting to their security policies. So I always felt, coming from software, we have a habit of trying to force sometimes customers into our security, where really now we want to be as flexible as possible to take into consideration all of their different security needs based on the region that they're in and their customers and the sensitivity of the data. So generally in the security of the data, and then in addition to that, understanding that certain customers have whether it's pharma or government, or they may have certain regulations and certain things that we need to be cautious of. So also making it flexible on what data we're going to take in. And then we have mechanisms to mask data, to not take in certain data, and really give customers the option of what data that they are okay with reporting on, and then they feel comfortable with us hosting for them in the cloud.
Okay, nice. And what about the differences between, say, smaller companies and larger enterprises, both for security and in general working with them? What kind of differences do you see working between the two?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say, there's definitely smaller size companies that they have some of the benefit of not being tied to a lot of legacy technology that's so ingrained in everything that they do, which I think is just the natural state of things, right? You get the best software you can at the time, but there's change management, rolling out that software, investments in that software. So you kind of have to, adopt to what you have today in order to go for the future. So I think one of the advantages I don't think too many people talk about is if you're a fast growing, smaller company, starting a company today, you're probably in the best place you've ever been because you have all of the latest and greatest technologies to choose from. What I would say is, usually companies that are fast growing, they want to obviously move quickly and, and have first mover advantage in their particular industry. So they do still care about obviously security and the like, but it's going to be a much faster, process in kind of defining it. I always think of, Facebook, move fast and break things, right? So we definitely see some of that. But I do still think that the smaller companies, certainly need to be conscious of that because they're going to be competing with larger companies that, that have security teams and have kind of gone through that before. Certainly on the larger side of companies, I think they're kind of still learning as they're going, as governments and change regulations around security. So it's definitely one of the things that you can't really leave it and forget it, but you have to be as agile as possible because a company regulations and data can really have a large impact on a company that especially can't move quickly to those changes.
And technology adoption, I mean, you touched on it there. The larger companies are often with more legacy systems and the smaller companies can be more agile. Is that that's across security. Is it also across technology adoption?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the good news is because of these technologies, it used to be a situation where you really need to integrate and move all of the data essentially to your system of record, to your ERP system, right? Whether that be an SAP, an Oracle, but usually you would have a system of record. If all of these other systems that we have out there, we have to bring back. I think over time, companies realize that that's not achievable at the rate that we're bringing on new systems. So I do think having an overall data strategy, it gives you more flexibility to have, a master data strategy that obviously includes an ERP, but then also can include other systems. And you're pulling data from third parties as well that obviously wouldn't make sense to all bring into your ERP, maybe pulling, data from 3PLs and carriers and suppliers and the like. So I do think that technology adoption is important for companies that have, more legacy systems and a lot of integration. But the good news is they don't have to necessarily continue full down that path and leveraging where they can kind of, bite small, chew fast, if you will, to take on better technology, moving forward. And we often say that to customers too, is, it doesn't need to be an overnight where you have to switch all the systems. We can put a process in place to, bring on systems, maybe in line with what you're, upgrading. So a lot of good example is a lot of customers are moving their warehouse management systems and transportation management systems to the cloud, right? And they maybe on premise with an older versions of the software. Well, if you're bringing your execution systems to the cloud, it may be a great time to really think about your overall data strategy and how to bring that data into a centralized, data lake, digital twin, etc. So usually we try to align with what the technology roadmap is in the future. So then that way they can move a little bit faster, and you're going to need to train employees on these new systems anyway. So you might as well make it easy on them, provide better reporting, and then enable, a better data strategy with that.
Okay. And where do you think supply chain is in terms of technology adoption compared to other industries? Things like IoT for gathering information and then AI for working on that data that's been captured.
It's a great question. I do think manufacturing and the IoT side is probably a little bit ahead of supply chain. But even more broadly, I always say go as close to the cash as possible. So if you're, marketing, automation and AI around predicting customer behavior, around trying to forecast what churn's going to look like, anything that's close to the customer, promotions to the customer, how creepy is it sometimes when you get an ad, on your phone, that's exactly what you need, right? And I think it all started there, and we've adopted a lot of that kind of close to the customer technology and applied it to supply chain. I think to your point, IoT is probably right behind that in understanding, kind of the full life cycle of a product. And I think manufacturing, consumers having to deal with a lot of end-to-end supply chain use cases is probably even a little bit ahead. But then as you move to retail, to logistics, to other areas, I think that's probably the biggest gaps to kind of catch up on the latest technology naturally.
Okay, and you alluded there to digital twins. So, and that you have some digital twin technology built into your own solution. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know digital twin in general gets a lot of hype. The way I look at a digital twin is simply a digital representation of physical processes in the supply chain that could be applied to people, that could be applied to assets, that could be applied to inventory, but really having that near real time view of everything that's happening across the supply chain. Within that, and obviously we provide near real time movement of data from really any system to a centralized data lake that really enables that digital twin across orders and shipments and inventory and people and process. A step further, we also apply modeling capabilities, simulation capabilities, the ability to run what if scenarios on everything from inventory to transportation to network design, based on that kind of continuous feed of data, which really enables a lot of both prescriptive and predictive analytics for the supply chain. And then the other piece that I know is getting into a ton of attention and has around ChatGPT and generative AI and machine learning and AI in general, having that continuous history of data. You also have massive amounts of data history, which really enables machine learning capabilities. So we do provide some packaged, we have this new module called Ask Morgan that was designed by one of our product developers. But essentially it's OpenAI ChatGPT based. It takes in all of your supply chain data internally and then also complements that with external data like labor data, weather data, et cetera, to help make actionable insights. So really doing a lot in that area. We also allow customers to kind of bring their own tools to the platform in case they have like a data science team that does machine learning, on Microsoft Azure. They can point their models and train their models based on the data from our digital twin as well. So it's pretty exciting.
And where does the name Morgan come from?
Her name's Morgan. I'll call her out, but she's been great and super excited. I think she's getting her master's now in computer science at Georgia Tech, and really excited about ChatGPT and everything. So we kind of let her run with it, and it's been pretty cool. So we want to make sure, because obviously we get asked the question quite a bit of what we're doing around generative AI and ChatGPT. And what's really neat is I definitely see the supply chain is some really cool use cases for the use of it. But I always say any of those engines are only as good as the data that you provide it.
Exactly.
And our mission has really been to make sure that companies have that one version of the truth, clean data. So I think it'll be pretty powerful as long as we stay true to our mission that we're providing that clean data across the supply chain.
Sure. The other big trend that we're hearing a lot about, apart from AI, is of course sustainability. So any sustainability wins that companies get from your platform?
Yeah, absolutely. And this we're starting to see more and more customers, track that as true KPIs, or what I would consider sustainability metrics. We have, obviously things like CO2 emissions, and tracking. But I would say generally the amount, which has been a focus, obviously, dead miles, and being able to to limit or make sure trucks are full, where we have a lot of customers that spend a tremendous amount on transportation, and obviously would lead to more CO2 emissions and waste around transportation. Even the operations in the DC, we see companies operating maybe 24/7, doing outbound, where they don't really need to be operating necessarily 24/7 to meet their SLAs. So reduction of machinery and work in the factory in the DC certainly would have a big impact on sustainability. And then I think customers really pushing those sustainability metrics to their top 5 from a KPI perspective. We'll really continue to put the focus on those areas, because if they're hitting the majority of their KPIs from a cost perspective, generally oftentimes they're also making an impact on sustainability.
Sure. Any customer wins that you can speak to? Any big customer gains that you can talk about? Any customer stories you want to share with us?
Yeah, sure. I would say, generally I want to say the biggest surprise is oftentimes when we'll implement our platform, there's these huge one-time, in the first few week savings. The customer, we had a big beer, wine, and spirits distributor. When we began implementing real-time visibility for them, they ended up finding $250,000 in inventory that they didn't know they had within 24 hours of implementing the system. Right. So just getting that kind of clean data and visibility, oftentimes it's just like, wow, like, this paid for itself, like within, a day of the solution. And then I think that, really changing the culture of our customers, where it's so often that, we'll implement, solutions where, companies really understand, or individuals really understand, how my performance is really contributing to the company as a whole. And I think all companies struggle with this. Certainly we have over the years as well, is, hey, I know I'm going to work, I'm doing my day to day, but like, how am I impacting the company, or how is my job really impacting? And one of the things I always loved about supply chain is it's all measurable, right? So if you put the right tools and technology in place, and I'm a picker in a DC, I know, hey, if I get my picks per hour up to 100 and I'm at 90, like this can save the company X amount. It means the customer's getting their product in a quicker manner. It means our stores are happy. It means we're hitting our team goals, which are hitting our DC goals, which are hitting our distribution goals. So being able to kind of create that hierarchy of metrics and accountability really drives a lot of performance, and I think engagement as well, and satisfaction with individuals' jobs. And I'll hear that a lot, like walking through a DC, like, hey, this group is in green today, or this group is a little bit in the red, or this group has improved X amount over the last couple of weeks, and really changing that kind of company culture and towards one of performance is really powerful, and we see that a lot.
Okay, cool. Where do you see the future of data management and supply chains heading? Where's all this going?
Yeah, well, I'll start. There's good news and bad news. I'll start with the bad news. So the bad news is I think more and more silos as in terms of data will exist. So I think the companies that aren't thinking about it at all, and believe me, I've worked at some of the large companies, for supply chain platforms and the like. But the reality is there's more and more devices and machines and systems to collect data, and that's getting more and more fragmented. So the data problem, in the sense of tons of sources across the supply chain, will get worse. The good news is the technology is there to intelligently determine how I best bring on these systems, how I can collect the data, how I can normalize it across all the systems to make better decisions. But the longer companies wait to do so, the harder it's going to be when they get there, right? So I love hearing when I come into a customer, they're like, hey, we've been thinking about this. Here's where we are kind of from a data strategy. How can Agillitics help us move faster? You guys are experts on these systems. We have all our marketing data. We have our merchandising data. We really need help on inventory and transportation, but here's kind of the strategy. Yep, we can help there. For customers that are like, we have 35 different supply chain systems, none of them talk to each other, and we do all of our reporting on spreadsheets, that's going to be a longer lift. But if they wait 2 years, then we have 40 systems and and our spreadsheets aren't opening because we have too much data in them. So I do think there should be somewhat of a sense of urgency on, getting going with that and having the right strategy. Because if I rewind 5 to 7 years ago, I think companies that placed bets on the wrong technologies, is very difficult to dig out of that. And I think right now the right technologies are out there for companies to do that, but they've, rightly so, been bitten so many times in the past by shiny object fatigue, as me and Sherry say. And I think that there needs to be that comfort level of, hey, there is good technology out there. This has been done before. This is being done by kind of the leaders in the industry. So we feel comfortable kind of placing those bets. So I think there's definitely reason for hope.
Great. Good. We are coming towards the end of the podcast now, Tim. Is there any question I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
No, I think you covered a lot, of the key areas. The only thing I would say is just, for companies it's easy to be overwhelmed by all the systems and the data, and reporting and analytics, is definitely something that's, it's seen as still maybe not getting those immediate returns or something we don't need to worry about tomorrow. But when it's done right, there is a lot of opportunity and savings and efficiencies to be had. So I'm hopeful going into 2024 that companies are thinking about it, and happy to talk with anyone on data at any time. So.
Fantastic. Tim, that's been great. If people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we touched on in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Yeah, I would say agillitics.com. Our platform's Agisite, so there's a number of content pieces and pages around our new Agisite platform to go to. You could also find us on LinkedIn. We're pretty active there as well under Agillitics.
Fantastic. Tim, that's been really interesting. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Awesome, Tom. Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.